Hi, everyone. This is Father Doug Scharf.
And I'm David Dixon.
I'm Father Derek Larson.
And welcome to this special edition of Sunday Ready. We are going to be reflecting together on the readings for Christmas Eve, which is this coming Friday, of course, December 24th. And we're looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you about these readings that we hear almost every year or very often, and they can become very familiar to us. And so hopefully we'll be able to go a little bit deeper today and offer some insights and some reflections that will be helpful to you. So the readings for this Christmas Eve are Isaiah 9, 2 through 7, Psalm 96, Titus 2, 11 through 14, and the Gospel of Luke chapter 2, 1 through 14. Hey, Derek and David, Merry Christmas, a few days early.
Yes, Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas.
Well, as I said in my opening comments, these readings we hear almost every year. We change it up occasionally, but we hear the basic themes and the basic elements of the story. And sometimes it can be hard to hear them in a fresh way and to bring meaning out of them when they become so familiar. So maybe we can help today with kind of unpacking these a bit for our listeners. So we're going to start with the prophet Isaiah, chapter 9. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in deep darkness, on them light has shined. Thoughts on Isaiah 9?
Well, this is a liberation song, a song that comes in the midst of people who have been oppressed, and they are feeling and seeing their liberation. So there's images of war, but specifically the end of war. We see here boots of tramping warriors. We see dividing plunder. We see all of these kind of images, but the point of this passage is that all those are coming to an end, and a child is born, a child that is to be a prince, that is to be a king, that will lead the people into endless peace, it says, towards the end here. So while this is a passage that talks a little bit about war and violence, its primary emphasis is the end of war and violence and the coming of peace. So that's just a little context about this particular passage. But what strikes me this year and this reading of it is the very last line that says, "The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." And I think that is just resonating in my heart a little bit, because that word zeal is not a word we use too often, but it
Right.
refers to passion. It refers to a little bit of a mixture of passion and jealousy, of kind of protectiveness. And I just find that a powerful image that God has a zeal for God's people, that God is not some God that is somewhat undisturbed or unmoved or unaffected by God's people, but God is passionate about doing the work of freeing God's people. God is passionate about bringing peace, about bringing comfort. This is the mission. This is the identity of who God is. It's not just some side thing that God does, but this is God's whole mission. God is zealous. God is passionate for God's people. And I just find that to be a really comforting thought.
Yeah, the word zeal is a powerful word in the biblical context. It means everything you just said, but it also kind of brings along with that a sense of devotion or commitment too. Mm-hmm. So when it says the zeal of the Lord, it's really talking about all that enthusiasm, all of that gusto that God brings to bear on his plan and his purpose, but it's also indicating to the hearer that God's committed to this thing, right? That God is not here one day and gone the next. That God is not the kind of ruler that can be deposed easily. That God is committed, steadfast, faithful to the plan and the purpose and intent on seeing a fulfillment of the promises given and his word spoken.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and during the season of Advent, we were studying the prophets. We looked at other prophets like Jeremiah and Malachi and Zephaniah. And this was a theme that we actually picked up on, that even in the midst of the language of judgment and wrath that sometimes makes us uncomfortable when reading the Old Testament, there is this underlying kind of consistency in all of the prophets that even those words of judgment are an expression of God's passion to be with God's people and to break down every wall, every obstacle, everything that would stand in the way of establishing justice and reconciliation and unity between God and God's people in creation. And so that was a theme that we actually picked up on throughout the season of Advent, this idea of God's passion and God's zeal and even God's jealousy for us in a positive sense, right?
Right.
I just want to note that, I think, folks, we can't hear this passage without hearing Handel's Messiah in the background. For unto us a son, a child is born, a son is given. And so we so quickly make the connection between this passage and Jesus as the Messiah, right? But this is early in the prophet Isaiah's ministry. This probably goes back to Isaiah himself. So we're talking 8th century, 800 years before Jesus. They're looking for a king, a ruler, an embodiment on earth of God's vision of justice and peace. And so I just want to lift that up, that this was an expectation, a yearning, a longing that was in the heart of God's people for centuries, looking for this. And they didn't see it right away in Jesus, right? And when we get to the gospel, we'll see the contrast or the paradox between the infancy narratives in the gospel and these images of mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace and authority. So when we get there, we can make those contrasts. But Isaiah was looking forward to this day of everlasting, unending peace, the fulfillment of the promises made to David.
And even Jesus speaks to that when he says, the prophets looked forward to my day and they rejoiced in it. So they were catching a glimpse or a vision as if they climbed on top of the mountain and could see what others could not see, so to speak. I love the phrase, for a child unto us, of course, Handel's Messiah in King James Version would say, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. It's interesting to me, that particular arrangement. The child is born, but the son is given. And there's a distinction being made there, right? Because, of course, in ancient Israel and certainly still today, there is the celebration of sonship, right? Or the celebration of the placement of a child or the recognition of a child within a family, whether it's bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. And this happens at the River Jordan when the heavens open, right? And the voice of the Father says, this is my beloved son. This is the place that the recognition of sonship on this child that has been born and the son that is given. So, and we all experience that, as the writer would say, that we cry within our own hearts, Abba Father, our Father, that placement and recognition of the Father and our place within the context of the family of God. I think that's just such a wonderful image of the love of God for all God's children.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to Psalm 96. The Christmas Eve Psalms rotate over 3 years, Psalm 96, Psalm 97, Psalm 98, right in a row. They're all Psalms of praise and Psalms that are high praise, exalting God's power and presence and glory. Sing to the Lord a new song, sing to the Lord all the whole earth. And so I think it's just fitting that on Christmas Eve, right after we hear the Isaiah reading, we have this kind of jubilation that erupts in the Psalms, whether it's 96, 97, or 98. Tell it out among the nations, the Lord is King, right?
Mm.
Well, this week I've been having some conversations with a couple of people about kind of this scary place we are environmentally in the world, and with climate change and the destruction of the environment. And so I don't want to bring a downer by bringing that into this joyous conversation. But I do want to highlight that when we approach Christmas, often we take a very anthropocentric approach to salvation, that humans are at the center of everything. And this psalm, I love that it is more cosmic, that it highlights that God's salvation is not just for people, but is for all of creation, all of the cosmos. All things are being wrapped up in God's zealous mission for salvation, for restoration. And so here we have that language of the whole earth, tell it to the whole earth, and then down in verse 11 in particular, let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad, let the sea thunder and all that is in it, let the field be joyful and all that is therein. Then shall all the trees of the wood shout for joy before the Lord when he comes to judge the earth. And so I just find that to be a powerful image. And I think that in this time of fear of climate change, there are two things that I'm kind of thinking of. One is that God cares about the planet, and the planet is involved in this Christmas story as well. And two, that if God cares about the planet, one of our ways of practicing incarnation, we're kind of using that phrase, one of our ways of celebrating Christmas ought to be coming alongside of God's mission to restore the world by also participating in ways to participate in climate justice. So that's something you probably won't hear too often in Christmas, but something that's on my mind as we read this passage.
I love it. I think it's great. I think it's important also in some of these texts that we will hear over the next few weeks. You're going to hear some sounds of judgment, right? Justice and righteousness in some of the writings. It's important for me, at least, to understand that when we read of God's judgment, as is the case in verse 13 of this psalm, he will judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with his truth. God's judgment is not punitive, it's corrective. God's judgment is not retributive, it is distributive. So when God judges a thing or a people, it is not to destruction, it is to correction. It is to bring the people or the circumstance or the situation, whatever it may be, to the correct level. The righteousness and justice is to make correct what has been wrong. Throughout the Bible, you have all these words that begin with the prefix re: restore, redeem, revive. It all means to bring back to what it's supposed to be, right? To bring it to an original cause, an original position, original state. So God's judgment comes not to destroy, but to bring back again what is the beauty and the fullness of God's plan and design for us and for all of creation. So when you hear of God's judgment, don't think, in terms of, he's going to send somebody to hell for all eternity. They're going to be burning and screaming and all this kind of stuff. No, God's judgment brings correction. It is unto righteousness that God's judgment comes to us. So I think that's an important thought to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we need to move on in a second. I think both of those are super helpful. I think it was N.T. Wright that said, we welcome judgment all the time in our lives. We want people to say this is right and this is wrong, or this is what you are due. You were treated unjustly. And so to think of God at the end of the age coming to put the world right, right?
Right.
To finally once and for all say, this is not okay. This is how this kingdom, this
Exactly.
reign, this world is going to look. If we think about it in those terms, then judgment becomes a very positive thing, something that we actually welcome and experience all the time in our lives and in our world. And Derek, thank you. I think that is a powerful reminder, not just in Psalm 96, but in many of the Psalms, especially the latter third of the Psalms, and in other books like Revelation, and even some of the parables of Jesus. The sense that creation is at the heart of this vision of salvation, not
Right.
just humanity. And I think that's a really helpful
Absolutely.
reminder, especially going into Christmas, when we do make it all about us, right?
Mm,
in lots of
true.
ways. Well, let's move on to Titus. It's interesting that we have readings on Christmas Eve from kind of an obscure epistle. We don't hear from Titus very often, but we do hear from this epistle, I think 2 of the 3 years on Christmas Eve. And it kind of goes with what you were saying, David. The grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation. We like to hear that.
Right.
Training us to renounce impiety and worldly passion, and in the present age to live lives that are self-controlled, upright, and godly. That this grace, this salvation that is coming, is also about transformation.
Yes.
It's also about living a different way of life that is reflective of that grace and that salvation in our lives, and in the world.
Right.
And then at the end here, we get that word zeal again, that God is redeem us from all iniquity and purity for himself, a people of his own who are zealous for good deeds. So God is zealous for us, and then he makes us zealous for good deeds, to live that kind of life and to put that into practice. So it's a powerful
Right.
connection to our other readings, I think.
It is. It's a great passage right here. Essentially, the first phrase first couple of phrases, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all. Somehow we change the word all to some or a few right here, but it's very clear. You know what the word all means in the Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic? It means all. It doesn't mean a few. It means all. It is to all, right? And you read on down and it says, he it is who gave himself for us that he might redeem. Well, the word might is not in the Greek, right? There is no might. God doesn't might do anything. It really should read, he it is who gave himself for us to redeem. It is an act of God, an act of redemption. Redeem us from all iniquity and purify himself a people. Everything that God does is to bring a people into deeper relationship with God. And I think if we see that at work in our life, the ups, the downs, the ins, the outs, the mountains, the valleys, all of those, the light, the darkness, all of that stuff, if we put it in a context or in a frame of God is working in our life to bring us into deeper relationship and connection with him, or with God. I think that is so helpful when you go through those moments of darkness, the dark night of the soul, and those experiences where you feel alone and everything is caving in around you and you just don't know what to do. God is at work in that, and if we surrender to the process, we'll come out experiencing the presence of God, I believe, in a very real and dynamic way.
Yeah. And you both have talked about sort of transformation in this passage, that God calls us to transformation. I think God also calls us to imitation. And this book of Titus, this letter written to Titus, is a letter really about imitation, imitating God, imitating those who are mentors and wise in our lives. And so I think that that's helpful in regard to this word zealous, that in our earlier passage, we see that God is zealous. And the reason that we are now zealous is because we are imitators of God. You can take this word zealous for good deeds and contrast it with that first sentence where it says, renounce impiety and worldly passions. So you're renouncing one kind of passion to take on another kind of passion. That we are, in being transformed and in receiving God's salvation, we are then imitators of the kind of salvation that God gives by doing those things for others in the world, by working for justice and righteousness, by working for good deeds. So this passage is sort of an implication of the salvation that we receive, is to continue participating in that salvation that takes place in the world.
I love it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. Very quickly, I just want to go back to the very first phrase, the grace of God has appeared. And I love that, because I think in my own experience and talking with people, grace is a hard concept, theological concept for people to understand. We have a wonderful definition in our prayer book, right? God's unearned, undeserved favor. But it has appeared, right? It's not just a concept. It's not just a theological idea. It has appeared. And of course, it has appeared in the person of Jesus, right? So we have not just a theological idea to wrestle with, but a person to be in relationship with, right? And I just think that is a beautiful thing to think about on Christmas Eve, and a helpful segue, I think, into our gospel reading in Luke, to think about the grace of God has appeared and been made manifest to us in the person of Jesus. So let's turn to the Gospel of Luke. Of all the passages we're talking about, this is probably the most familiar for people in terms of the basic elements of the story, shepherds and angels and baby Jesus wrapped in swaddling clothes and in a manger. But there is so much going on in these 14 verses, right? In terms of the politics of the ancient world, issues of justice and inversion of the social order. I mean, just lots of things that are behind this, what we sort of make holy on Christmas Eve. It is holy, but you know what I mean? It has a glow about it. And we miss oftentimes those social and political and economic implications that are here in the text. Right in verse 1, in those days, a decree went out from the emperor, right? The emperor is the one who's telling everybody what to do here in verse 1. By the end, that narrative is going to be changed pretty significantly, right? So where do you want to jump into this text?
Well, it's one of my favorite texts, I have to be honest. I love Luke too. I particularly, I don't know, I like some of the phrases in the King James Version. I love the first phrase, and it came to pass. Here it says, in those days a decree went out. In King James, it says, it came to pass. I just love that phrase because it's not here to stay. Whatever you're going through comes to pass. You're going to get through it. You're going to get on the other side of it. But what's going on here, I was thinking about this morning. Mary has just had this visitation not too long ago, the Annunciation. The messenger comes. It says, what does the messenger say? Hail Mary, highly favored. You are highly favored, Mary. But somehow Mary, who is highly favored, is in the wrong city to give birth to the Christ, right? The ancient prophecy says, out of Bethlehem Ephratah shall come the deliverer. I mean, this has been set in motion, but Joseph and Mary are in the wrong location. So God has to raise up an emperor that will send forth a registration to get everybody to move, just so Mary and Joseph can get where they're supposed to be, so they can give birth to the child that was prophesied in the ancient text. I know that may sound convoluted, but God will move the world to get you positioned where you need to be so that the promises of God can come forth in your life. And I take that very personally. I believe that God orchestrates things in our life to get us where we need to be. So that, and it inspires me because it tells me that even highly favored folks can miss it. Even highly favored people can be in the wrong place and God will still move to get them into the right place. So I'm not in a boat all by myself when I goof up and mess up and I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time. God still moves in our life to get us where we need to be. And I think that's such a word of encouragement for not only for me, but for, I think, young people and everybody. It doesn't matter how many times you mess up, God's still working things out for your life.
And I'll just jump in there and, remind folks that in Matthew's gospel, the same sort of thing happens, but they've got to get from Bethlehem to Nazareth, right? So all these things are happening with King Herod and threats made, and of course the slaughtering of the innocents. They flee to Egypt, then they leave Egypt. Herod's son takes over, so they head up to Nazareth. So there's this whole circumstances and series of events that get them from Bethlehem to Nazareth to fulfill the prophecy that he would be a Nazarene, right? And in Luke, they start in Nazareth, and it's the imperial census that gets them to Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy that he'd be born in the city of David. So it's amazing how these two different gospels give us these different versions of the historical events.
Yeah, they do tell different stories about the nativity, and I'm always struck in this passage about, as we hear the Christmas story and we do our pageants, we have a very clear image in our minds of the stable and of the animals and of the manger, which is not in Matthew, which is not in Mark, which is not in John, and then in Luke, it's almost in passing. It's just barely there in the sentence. Right. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger. And if you're wondering why she laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn.
Right.
It doesn't mention the stable necessarily. In some traditions, it's a cave. It doesn't mention the cave, but it's almost in passing because there's no place for them in the inn. Mm-hmm. And then later, when this news is told to the shepherds, it says, you'll find the child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger. So I just find it interesting and it may be exciting that this tiny little sentence has become this huge and beautiful image and narrative. And I think it's important. It's important to me because it just highlights the humility of God. It highlights that that God came into this world as vulnerable as could be.
Right.
Came into the world as a baby, lying in a manger. And sometimes we hear this on Christmas Day that mangers are not clean. That we have a very cute and pretty image of this in our minds. But this was messy and this was vulnerable, and but that wasn't the end, and perhaps that's why Luke put it in here, but in just such a passing way that that he wanted to point out that God started in humble places, but that wasn't the end. That wasn't the end for God.
You're starting to tiptoe on my sermon now, Derek. So, I'm kidding. No, listen, I want to pick up on that because I think the same thing is happening in this passage that happened with John the Baptist. Remember when John the Baptist came on the scene? It was, when so-and-so was governor of such and such place and so-and-so was in charge, all this litany of imperial leaders and regional authorities. The word of the Lord comes to John in the wilderness, right? In the same way, we start in Rome with the emperor. We go to Syria, where Quirinius is governor. We go to Judea, to Nazareth. We end up in a shepherd's field, right? And the glory of God and the proclamation of the angels comes not in Rome, not in Syria, not in Judea. None of these places where you might be associated with power or glory or authority. It comes to the shepherds in the shepherd's field. And I just think I love the way Luke does that consistently throughout these first 2 chapters, whether it's the Magnificat, the Benedictus, the John the Baptist, and now the birth of Jesus. There is this inversion of power. And if there's anything that I think people should know about this reading, that for me, when I first learned it, was just it broke the whole story wide open, is that the declaration of the angels was a direct affront against the authority and identity of the emperor himself, right? And the reason we know that is because the language that is used, it would be born to you in the city of David, a savior, the Messiah, who is Christ the Lord, and then he's the one who will bring peace, right? And we actually have an inscription from the year 9 BC that is an attribution to the emperor, that refers to Augustus as Savior, Lord, and the one who would establish peace, right? So there's no mistaking that Luke is declaring that this baby born and laid in a manger, and this proclamation to shepherds in a field is establishing God's true reign and God's true justice and God's true peace on the earth. And it's not found with Augustus in Rome or Quirinius. So I think if people could really get into that, behind what is behind Luke's, what is motivating Luke's narrative here, it just breaks it wide open.
That's good stuff. I think also one thing that I really like is in this passage, and everything that you both have said is so powerful, and there's just so much to dive into and appreciate about this. I like where the shepherds come and they share with Mary and Joseph all the things that they had heard declared to them by the angels. And it says, everyone was amazed at what the shepherds had told them. And then you have this line, but Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. Mm-hmm. Now, you would think that Mary would treasure all the words of the wise men or the magi, right? I mean, they're wise. But it doesn't say that about her encounter with them. It says it about her encounter with these lowly shepherds. One, and I may be reading into this, but I think it still works. One reason I think Mary treasures and ponders what shepherds have to say is because shepherds know what it's like to raise a lamb to be taken to be sacrificed. And so here you have Mary, who is giving birth to a lamb, is going to have to give it up. And hear her son say, woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. I'm on the cross. Go home, Mary. Only shepherds know what it's like to raise something to be given to sacrifice. And this is what Mary's is looking at in her future.
Well, and only Luke kind of continues Mary's story, where Mary is there at other parts in Jesus' life and ministry. In John's gospel, she's there at the cross, but only Luke has her in the upper room, right, waiting on the day of Pentecost, praying with the disciples. So there might be something to that, the story of Mary that continues.
Nice.
Well, that's a lot for Christmas Eve. I reserve the right to use all and anything that you guys have said in my sermon on Friday night. But no, it's always a joy to just spend some time talking about God's Word. There's just so much that we can unpack, and both of you have offered some amazing insights into these readings. So thank you. I guess we can't say we hope that you're Sunday ready. We hope that you are Christmas Eve ready by listening to this special podcast. See you Friday, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.